The morning began like any other, with sunlight warming the kitchen tiles and the familiar hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. It was one of those mornings where nothing appears out of place, where routine feels like a cushion against chaos. My wife sat across from me with an expression that was almost unreadable, her spoon circling the surface of her coffee without ever lifting it to her lips. She didn't look tired or upset, just detached, as if her mind had already stepped beyond the walls of our home. I had no reason to expect a change, no warning that the next word she spoke would alter the foundation of our marriage. She reached into her bag and placed a folder between us with a deliberate calm that felt unnervingly final. I saw a faint crease at the corner of her mouth. Not a smile, yet something close to relief, like a person who has rehearsed a difficult task and is proud of finally delivering it. I opened the folder expecting something mundane, perhaps receipts or documents related to our home insurance, and instead found a banking form with our names typed neatly at the top. It was not a suggestion or a proposal. It was already prepared, signed on her end, awaiting only mine. She spoke in a tone that carried no warmth and no invitation for conversation. She said we should separate our accounts because it was better for us, as if she were announcing a weather report or reading instructions on a box. There was no tremble in her voice, no flicker of doubt in her eyes. She had made this decision long before that Sunday morning. I searched her face for an explanation, a reason, anything that might soften the blow, but she continued stirring her coffee without ever meeting my gaze. It was not the sentence itself that struck me. It was the way she delivered it, like an administrative update rather than a marital shift. The silence that followed stretched thin across the table. My chest tightened as the implications unfolded in my mind. Marriage is not only emotions and affection. It is structure, trust, and shared vision. Money becomes a language couples use to build a future. To separate accounts felt like creating two different languages in the same house. It meant two destinations, two priorities, and eventually two worlds. I wondered if she expected a fight, an outburst, a desperate plea. Yet none of those instincts came. What I felt was not anger. It was a cold realization that something had been happening beneath the surface without my awareness, and this paper was only the visible part. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because my voice abandoned me. The nod felt like a stamp sealing my own fate. She slid the form closer, confident that the decision was now mutual. My hand hesitated before picking up the pen. I told myself this was temporary, a practical adjustment, something couples did when roles changed or responsibilities shifted. Yet a deeper voice whispered that it was a test I hadn't seen coming, one that I might already have failed by not questioning it. When I signed my name, something subtle yet irreversible shifted between us. Her shoulders relaxed as if a burden had lifted, while an invisible weight landed squarely on mine. I tried to distract myself by focusing on small details in the room. The ticking of the clock, the faint scent of toast, the sound of a car passing outside. Ordinary noises that suddenly felt foreign in a space that used to feel safe. She collected the papers and placed them back into the folder with the composure of someone closing a chapter they no longer wish to read. I watched her leave the table, her footsteps steady, while mine remained anchored to the floor. I stayed seated long after she disappeared into the hallway, as if rising too quickly would cause the consequences of that signature to crash down all at once. That morning, nothing exploded. No door slammed, and no accusations flew across the room. The storm had no thunder. It arrived disguised as a simple sentence spoken over a quiet breakfast. Only later would I understand that that moment was not about money. It was about direction, control, and unspoken truths. The neighborhood had no idea then that a fuse had been lit inside our home. Yet every storm begins with a shift in the air, and that sentence was the wind that announced the coming hurricane. I sat alone at the table after she left the room, the folder still in front of me. Something about the document felt unsettling, so I read through it again, line by line. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary financial form, but the details revealed something far more calculated. It went beyond opening a new account. It redistributed responsibility in a way that placed every essential burden on me. Electricity, water, internet, groceries, school fees, and even the maintenance of the house had been neatly assigned to my side of the arrangement. Her salary was left untouched, free from obligation. It wasn't merely a separation of accounts. It was a shift in power disguised as a practical adjustment. My heart tightened as I realized how meticulously this had been prepared. There were clauses I had never seen before, typed with precision, as though someone had spent weeks constructing them. It felt less like a banking form and more like a strategic document crafted for a negotiation I didn't know existed. There was no room for discussion, no shared signature space, no mention of balance or fairness. The language looked official, yet the tone was cold, clinical, and detached from anything resembling partnership. It was a contract where I was the contributor and she was the beneficiary. Memories began surfacing in my mind. The subtle comments she made over the past few months about financial independence. The sudden interest in managing our bills. The quiet phone calls she took in the evenings. At the time, none of it seemed unusual, but now, looking back, every action felt like a piece of a puzzle I had never been invited to solve. I wondered when she had decided to redraw the boundaries of our life together. Was it after an argument I had forgotten? Was there someone advising her? Or had she simply grown tired of the idea of shared responsibility? I thought about how my parents had lived. My father always said that marriage meant carrying each other, not measuring who walked the longest distance. Finances were never weapons in their home. They were tools used to build a life. What lay before me was not a tool. It was an instrument of division, sharp enough to cut a marriage in two without spilling a drop of blood. The more I read, the more I understood that this wasn't about freedom or fairness. It was about control. She wanted to keep her income safe from obligations, while mine became the backbone of our existence. Despite the rising discomfort, I didn't stand up or walk away. I didn't call her back into the room or question her intentions. Instead, I picked up the pen resting beside the form. My hand trembled slightly as I signed. The ink spread slowly across the paper, absorbing my silence, sealing a decision I didn't fully understand. I told myself it was easier to agree than to spark conflict. I convinced myself that marriage required compromise and that maybe this was her version of contribution. Yet there was a heaviness in my chest that refused to ease, no matter how rationally I tried to interpret the moment. When she returned, she didn't ask if I had questions or if I felt comfortable with what I had just signed. She didn't offer reassurance or explanation. Instead, she looked at the paper the way investors look at contracts that secure their future. Her lips curved into a satisfied smile, one that carried neither gratitude nor affection. It was the expression of someone who believed they had achieved a victory. She closed the folder slowly, almost ceremoniously, as if the form was the conclusion of a plan finally executed. I realized then that betrayal doesn't always erupt with shouting or broken dishes. Sometimes it arrives politely, dressed in legal terms and typed sentences. It hides behind organization, logic, and good intentions. Yet its damage is no less profound. It rewires trust quietly, shifting balance without warning. That morning, I believed I'd signed a banking form. Only later did I understand I had signed the opening chapter of a conflict I didn't know existed. The paper wasn't about accounts. It was about rewriting the rules of our marriage, one signature at a time. That evening, I returned home expecting an ordinary meal. The house smelled of roasted meat and freshly baked bread, but the atmosphere tasted like something else entirely. My wife moved through the kitchen with unusual ease, humming under her breath, as if she were preparing for a celebration. I took a seat at the table, unaware of what was about to unfold. Moments later, the doorbell rang. Her mother entered first, followed by her sister and a cousin I had only met once. None of them had announced their visit. Their smiles were thin, stretched tight like fabric under strain. It did not feel like a family gathering. It felt like people arriving with purpose. They sat around the table with an uncanny sense of organization, as if each chair had been assigned. My wife positioned herself beside her mother, not across from me as she usually did. The change was subtle, but it shifted the alignment in the room. I felt like a defendant without being told the charges. Her mother glanced at the documents on the sideboard, the same folder from that morning, and I realized this dinner was not spontaneous. It was a continuation. The conversation began lightly, but the tone shifted quickly into something colder. They never addressed me directly at first. Instead, they spoke to each other while aiming their words like arrows in my direction. Her sister chuckled as she mentioned men who panic when women manage their own finances. The cousin sighed theatrically and wondered aloud why some husbands need to control every coin to feel significant. My wife nodded, her eyes fixed on her plate, pretending to be a passive listener. Every phrase they threw into the air carried an accusation wrapped in politeness. There was no shouting, no confrontation, only carefully chosen sentences designed to provoke without ever looking guilty. I listened in silence, studying their expressions. Each time I expected the conversation to shift towards something neutral, it circled back with renewed intensity. They spoke of independence, modern relationships, and personal boundaries, but the subtext was sharp. My signature on that document had not appeased them. It had empowered them. They had come to confirm that I understood the new order. The dinner table became less a place for food and more an arena where loyalty and obedience were assessed. I recognized the tactics. They wanted me to react, to defend myself, to give them something they could twist into proof that I was unreasonable. As they continued, I realized something crucial. They weren't improvising. They had rehearsed this. Their rhythm was too synchronized, their sentences too perfectly aligned. They were not discussing a marital decision. They were constructing a narrative, one where I was the obstacle to my wife's financial liberty. The smiles they wore weren't signs of joy. They were masks, flimsy but firmly attached. The more they spoke, the more I felt like a spectator in my own home. It was as though a judgment had already been passed, and I was merely expected to accept the verdict. I tried to focus on the meal, but every bite felt heavy. My wife remained mostly silent, only offering supportive nods when her mother or sister made a point. She didn't have to speak. They spoke for her. The form I had signed that morning was no longer just a signature. It had become ammunition. The dinner was not about approval or explanation. It was about establishing a hierarchy in which I stood at the bottom. Their confidence made sense now. They acted like victors who believed the battle had ended before I even knew it had begun. Near the end of the meal, her mother placed her fork down with deliberate calm and looked directly at me for the first time. The room fell silent, as if everyone were waiting for this moment. She smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes and said that real couples respect financial boundaries. The statement was wrapped in diplomacy, yet it felt like a final declaration. It didn't matter that I had not opposed anything. My compliance had been interpreted as defeat. I realized then that I was not sitting with family. I was sitting with strategists who treated relationships like negotiations and marriage like a contract. I did not respond, not because I lacked words, but because I understood that silence was the only tool I had left. Anything I said would have been used against me, twisted into evidence of resistance. The dinner eventually ended, but the feeling of judgment lingered long after the plates were cleared. As they left, each gave me a look that carried both satisfaction and warning, as if they had secured something only they understood. That night, as I lay awake, I understood the truth. The document I signed was never about money. It was a foundation for something deeper, something orchestrated. A quiet shift had taken place, and I had walked into it unaware. I had not joined them for dinner. I had been summoned, and the verdict had already been written. I went to bed late that night, but sleep refused to come. My mind replayed the dinner like a courtroom session where I had entered without a lawyer. The smiles, the comments, and the confidence they carried did not match an ordinary family concern. Something far more strategic was unfolding. I decided to walk to the kitchen for a glass of water, hoping the simple act would clear my thoughts. As I approached the hallway, however, I heard voices that made me stop mid-step. My wife's tone was low, almost a whisper, yet it carried an unsettling certainty. She was speaking to her mother. The house was dark enough that they assumed I was asleep, but their voices traveled through the walls. I heard my wife repeat a sentence that froze the air around me. She signed. Not we signed. Not he agreed. The emphasis was not on a mutual decision. It was on a step completed, like a task crossed off a list. There was a satisfaction in her tone that did not belong to someone sharing a harmless update. It was the tone of someone reporting progress. Her mother released a sound that was not relief. It was a sigh of triumph, a quiet exhale that carried the weight of expectation fulfilled. I had heard people sigh after finishing a puzzle, after winning an argument or proving a point. This sigh belonged in that category. It was not the reaction of someone happy for her daughter's security. It was the reaction of someone convinced that a stage of a plan had succeeded. That single sound shifted the meaning of everything that had happened that day. I pressed my back against the wall, careful not to make a noise. A strange sensation crept into my chest. Until that moment, I had convinced myself that maybe I was overthinking things. Maybe separating accounts was simply a modern idea she embraced. But listening to them speak, I realized this had little to do with practicality. This was the language of strategy, not finances. I had not been part of conversation earlier. I had been part of a maneuver. Her mother spoke again, quieter this time, but the tone was unmistakable. It carried the authority of a general explaining the next step to a soldier. I caught fragments about responsibility, independence, and making sure things were irreversible. None of these words fit the narrative of a loving marriage. They belonged to someone establishing ownership of a situation. The hallway felt colder as I pieced together the implications. They were not reacting to what happened. They were executing it. I thought back to the past months. Small comments my wife had made suddenly returned with new meaning. Suggestions about paying bills earlier than usual, subtle remarks about how couples should keep some things separate, and a sudden insistence on having documents organized. At the time, I interpreted them as harmless preferences. Now they felt like breadcrumbs I had ignored. I wonder how long this had been in motion and why I'd been so blind to it. Standing in that hallway, I understood something important. They had not asked for separation. They had arranged it. The document was not the start. It was a milestone. The dinner was not a celebration. It was a confirmation, and I was expected to accept my new position without protest. Their confidence at the table made sense now. They believed I had already forfeited my voice. That was the first real red flag, not the paper I signed, not the questions they asked, but the certainty in their whispers. I remained silent, not because I was scared, but because silence became my shield. I realized reacting too soon would reveal my awareness, and I was not ready for that confrontation. Silence allowed me to think, observe, and understand. There are moments in life when speaking gives power to those who want to use your words against you. That night, I chose not to give them anything. I returned to the bedroom, my steps careful, my mind racing with clarity I did not have before. As I lay down, I stared at the ceiling and understood that this was no misunderstanding. Something deeper was happening, and I could no longer pretend it was harmless. They believed they had gained control, and for the first time, I saw the truth behind their smiles. The red flag was not the form itself. It was the quiet celebration of a victory I never agreed to fight. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to prepare. This was no longer about accounts. It was about defending the very structure of my life. Silence would be my strategy, but awareness would be my weapon. The following Friday morning began with the same rhythm as every payday. I logged into my banking app out of habit, expecting to review the usual deposits and payments. My salary had arrived, but something else caught my attention before I could blink. A large transfer had already taken place. The amount was exact, down to the last decimal, and it was not one I recognized. At first, I assumed it was an error. Banks make mistakes, systems glitch, people misclick. Yet the more I scrolled, the more I understood that this was no accident. Every household expense, from the mortgage to utilities, from insurance premiums to quarterly maintenance, had suddenly migrated under my name. Not one item remained on hers. It was as if someone had dissected our shared responsibilities with a scalpel and stitched them back together on only one side. My pulse tightened. I knew I had never authorized these changes. The signatures required for such transfers were not mine. I stared at the numbers, feeling the weight of something invisible pressing against my chest. The decisions implied on the screen were not financial choices. They were declarations of ownership over obligations. It was a rearrangement of burdens, perfectly executed, leaving no trace of negotiation or consent. In that moment, the form I'd signed took on a different meaning. It was no longer a request. It was a blueprint. I drove to the bank because some questions demand physical answers. The air in the branch was cool, sterile, and indifferent, much like the tone of the documents that now govern my life. I sat across from a representative, a young man whose polite smile did not match the seriousness of my concern. When he looked at my account file, the smile faltered. He excused himself, returning moments later with a supervisor who handled clients like doctors handle troubling scans. She inspected the transfers and confirmed that the changes were linked to the form submitted the week prior. According to their records, I had approved the reallocation of financial duties. I felt a rush of disbelief. That form had not contained any such details. Yet now those details have been typed, arranged, and submitted under my authorization. The supervisor showed me printed confirmations that bore my name, my signature, and the timestamp of approval. I knew I had never seen these pages before. Someone had added terms after I signed, and the bank treated them as binding. The realization hit me with a weight I was not prepared to carry. The separation of accounts was never about securing independence. It was about removing her from liability and placing the full financial structure of our household solely on my shoulders. As I drove home, my thoughts battled each other. I asked myself when marriage had turned into a ledger, when had promises been replaced by clauses and expectations traded for entitlements. My father once said that finances are not the heart of a marriage, but they are its bloodstream. Cut one artery, and the relationship bleeds without anyone hearing a sound. That day, I felt the first drop. When I stepped inside, she greeted me with casual interest, asking if everything was fine. Her question was delivered with the innocence of someone who already knew the answer. I watched her as she stirred her coffee. The same gesture she had made the day she slid that folder toward me. Her calmness was not ignorance. It was confidence. She expected no resistance. She believed silence equaled surrender. For the first time, I understood the elegance of the trap. The strategy was subtle, almost artistic. No confrontation, no accusations, no visible votes. Just signatures, transfers, and responsibilities redirected one click at a time. She had not left the marriage. She had stepped out of its obligations. I said nothing. Words, at that moment, would have been fireworks lighting the battlefield before I had chosen my position. Silence allowed me to study the terrain. Silence let me see that I was no longer a husband in the traditional sense. I had become a financier, an engine that powered a structure I no longer controlled. Yet there is one thing financial traps never account for. They assume the person caught in them is not looking for the exit. As I sat at the kitchen table that evening, I understood something powerful. Silence can be a shield, but it can also be preparation. A pause before movement. A breath before strategy. And I knew then that silence would not last forever. The morning after the discovery, I woke with a decision formed so clearly in my mind that it felt like it had been waiting there for weeks. Silence had helped me observe, but now I needed understanding. I prepared myself not for an argument at home, but for answers from the institution that had unknowingly become an accomplice. I requested an appointment with the bank's director, bypassing the customer service desks entirely. When someone alters the architecture of your life without permission, you do not speak to clerks. You speak to the architect's supervisor. The director's office was a world removed from the busy lobby. Dark wood panels, certificates on the wall, shelves lined with awards and photographs from corporate events. He greeted me with the polite confidence of a man who believed he had seen every issue a customer could present. That confidence faded the moment I placed the folder on his desk. His posture shifted. He pushed aside the papers he had been reviewing and slid the folder toward himself with deliberate care. As he examined the forms, I watched his expression change. His features were calm, but his eyebrows tightened, and his hand lingered on certain pages longer than usual. When he reached the section assigning household obligations exclusively to me, he sat back, removed his glasses, and studied me as if reassessing who I was. He asked how these papers had been presented to me, who had prepared them, and why I had signed without requesting clarification. I answered each question with the honesty of someone who now understood that trust can sometimes be more expensive than ignorance. He leaned forward. His tone was controlled, but something beneath it carried weight. He explained that the form was not standard procedure. It resembled official documentation, but had been altered. The amendments appeared after my signature, meaning someone had added terms to a legally binding file without my consent. He pointed out subtle differences in font and formatting, inconsistencies invisible to an untrained eye. These changes, he said, indicated deliberate manipulation. Unauthorized modifications on a financial document were not mistakes. They were violations. The director paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle in the air. His voice shifted into something quieter, more cautious. He told me cases like this were rare, often driven by internal motivations rather than institutional error. Without naming anyone, he hinted that whoever handled the submission had knowledge of banking procedures or access to someone who did. His concern was not only professional, it was legal. He printed copies of the original submission history, timestamps, and digital trails that confirmed his findings. He offered them to me, saying these documents could be useful if I chose to pursue action. As I held the papers, a strange calm washed over me. My instinct was not to rush home and confront my wife. Confrontation without clarity is noise. Evidence, on the other hand, is strategy. I asked if the bank intended to question the person who submitted the altered form. The director hesitated before replying that their internal protocol would require an investigation. His tone suggested that whatever had happened was serious enough to concern more people than just me. I thanked him and stood to leave, but before I reached the door, he called after me. He said there are moments in life when people underestimate the quiet ones. They assume silence equals weakness, but silence is sometimes the space where truth gathers its strength. I left the bank not with anger, but with something far more powerful. I carried proof. Driving home, I did not feel defeated. For the first time since this ordeal began, I understood something fundamental. They had expected compliance, not competence. They had predicted a reaction, not preparation. They believed I would drown in confusion, never imagining I would swim through the details and find air. That day, the balance shifted, not financially, but psychologically. I no longer stood in the middle of a hidden battlefield, unaware of the terrain. I saw the trenches. I saw the weapons. And now, I held the first piece of ammunition. Evidence is not loud, but once collected, it speaks louder than any accusation. I did not confront anyone that night. The moment for confrontation was not yet ripe. Storms do not announce themselves with whispers. They gather, they grow, and then they break everything in their path. I knew the storm was coming. I was no longer the man waiting for thunder. I was preparing for lightning. The evening after my meeting with the bank director, I sat in the living room without turning on the lights. The house was quiet, but silence no longer felt like surrender. It felt like space to think, space to rebuild. I stared at the wall and realized something significant. If someone had gone to great lengths to isolate me financially, then my greatest mistake would be to remain predictable. The form I signed had given them confidence. It had led them to believe I was already trapped. That assumption became my advantage. The next morning, I returned to the bank, not to question anything further, but to act. I met with the director again and requested something specific. I wanted a new account created under conditions that ensured privacy. He asked if this was related to the previous issue, but I gave no explanation. Some answers are best kept close. He nodded, processed the request, and within minutes handed me details of an account no one else knew existed. It was quiet, clean, and unconnected to the financial structure that had been built around me. Leaving the bank, I felt something I had not felt in weeks. Control. My salary, the same source they had tried to redirect, now had a different destination. I updated payment instructions through channels they could not trace. I informed my employer privately of the changes and ensured that no notifications would be sent to our shared email. The next payday would arrive, just as before, but this time, the river they expected to drink from would be flowing elsewhere. Bills continued to be paid, yet not by me. The automated system they had set up ran on assumptions. It was designed to pull funds from the account they believed I depended on. Within weeks, that account would run dry. I did not stop the payments entirely. That would reveal my move too early. I allowed smaller amounts to continue, enough to maintain the illusion of cooperation, while the bulk of my earnings moved safely into the new territory I had created. Every shift was calculated, subtle, precise. Meanwhile, life at home remained remarkably normal on the surface. My wife behaved as though the financial arrangement had settled permanently. She spent her afternoons with her mother, both of them confident that I had accepted my role. I observed their conversations from a distance. I noticed how her mother spoke about responsibility, how she praised my wife for taking control of her future, how they both believed they had secured a victory before the battle had truly begun. Their certainty was almost theatrical. Her mother's confidence grew stronger each day. She walked around the house with an air of ownership, offering unsolicited advice about energy bills, renovation plans, and investment opportunities, as if the house belonged more to her daughter than to me. The way she spoke, one would believe she had designed the foundation herself. I listened without responding. Every word she spoke revealed how unaware she was of the terrain. A strategist who misreads the battlefield often celebrates too early. One afternoon, she made a remark that crystallized everything. She mentioned that some men need to be taught their place. It was then I realized this was never about money. It was a campaign designed to transform me from a partner into a silent financier. What she could not fathom was that silence in the right hands is not submission. It is preparation. Quiet people are often mistaken for weak because their strength is invisible until it is needed. I continued to refine my plans. I gathered more documents, printed statements from the new account, and created a timeline of transactions. I mapped every change, every signature, every manipulated clause. One day, all of it would matter. Not today, not tomorrow, but at the moment when truth would become undeniable. Every night, I lay in bed beside a woman who believed she had outplayed me. She slept peacefully, unaware that control had begun shifting back. Her mother came and went with the same smug certainty, convinced she had redesigned the structure of my life. Neither of them realized something vital. When people build traps, they rarely consider that the person they trap might learn the design. My silence was no longer the silence of surrender. It was the silence of a man who had begun to move his pieces without announcing his intentions. I was no longer reacting. I was rewriting the board. The walls they believed were closing in had started to push outward. I watched them smile, unaware that the ground beneath them was shifting. It happened on a Wednesday afternoon, the kind of day when nothing announces trouble. The sun was polite, the air was still, and the neighborhood moved at its usual pace. I was in my home office reviewing documents when I heard the front door open. Her mother entered without knocking, as she often did, comfortable enough to act as though the house belonged to her. She greeted my wife with a tone that suggested she had arrived for an inspection, not a visit. Her eyes darted to the envelopes near the counter, then to the computer on the table, as if searching for proof of something she already expected to find. After exchanging a few whispered words with my wife, she asked a question loud enough for me to hear. She wanted to check my contribution. The phrase was delivered with authority, not curiosity. It was clear she believed she had the right to monitor every financial move I made. My wife walked toward the laptop with a calmness that suggested she anticipated nothing unusual. She typed in a few commands and waited for the numbers to appear. Her expression did not change, but her mother stepped closer, hovering like someone expecting a harvest. Silence followed, a silence thick enough to pull attention from every corner of the room. My wife stared at the screen. Her mother demanded she scroll again. My name appeared on the account, but below it were lines of inactivity. No payments, no transactions, no transfers. The structure they had built, the plan they had celebrated, had hit an unforeseen wall. The account they assumed was their leverage had stopped breathing. She assumed I was trapped, but she misread me. Silence didn't mean acceptance. Silence meant preparation. The moment I rerouted my salary, the entire structure she relied on collapsed. It was not the money that caused her panic. It was the realization that she had lost access to something she never actually owned. That was why the scream shook the neighborhood. She was not mourning a transaction. She was mourning a strategy. My wife watched the fallout with eyes clouded by confusion. She had seen her mother orchestrate relationships for years, always achieving what she wanted without being questioned. She had never imagined a scenario where a husband would simply step aside, avoid confrontation, and unravel the plan without argument. Her mother had taught her that men fight loudly, break things, shout, and demand respect. She never prepared her daughters for a man who thinks before moving and moves without speaking. The truth hung in the air like a scent no one could ignore. Power, once challenged, exposes its weakness. Her mother had built her identity on dominance, instructing her daughters to control before being controlled. But when dominance encountered strategy, it crumbled. The strength she prided herself on was not strength. It was dependency disguised as authority. Her influence only existed as long as others played by her rules. The moment I changed the game, she lost not control over me, but control over her narrative. I realized then that some victories do not require speeches. They require restraint. By refusing to argue, I forced her to confront a truth she had spent her life avoiding. Power rooted in manipulation has no foundation. It collapses when someone stops participating. She could scream, accuse, blame, and justify, but she could not undo the one fact that now stood between us. The decision she tried to claim for herself had been taken from her hands without force, without threats, and without confrontation. Silence became my victory, not because it humiliated her, but because it protected me. In that silence, I reclaimed my dignity, my finances, and my peace. In that silence, she discovered something far more terrifying than defiance. She discovered someone who no longer needed her approval to exist. The truth she screamed into the neighborhood was not that I closed my account. It was that she never had control over me in the first place. And once that truth escaped, it could never be unscreamed. The tension in the house did not vanish overnight, but it changed direction. It no longer pointed toward me. It circled the decisions that had been made in secret, the conversations whispered behind walls, and the assumptions that had turned my silence into their confidence. I did not react with the vengeance they anticipated. I did not storm out, threaten legal action, or expose anyone online. Those are tactics people choose when they want attention. What I wanted was something far simpler and far more powerful. I wanted clarity. One evening, after days of quiet reflection, I sat at the kitchen table and asked my wife to join me. The same table where she once placed that infamous folder now held nothing but 2 glasses of water. This time, I was the one who initiated the conversation. She sat across from me, cautious but curious, no longer accompanied by her mother's influence. Her eyes looked different. The confidence she once borrowed from someone else had dissolved, replaced by questions she did not yet know how to ask. I spoke slowly, not with anger or bitterness, but with certainty. I told her that marriages are not built on transactions, conditions, or signatures. They are built on shared purpose. If the vision of 2 people heads in different directions, the relationship becomes a business contract waiting to expire. I told her that separation of accounts did not scare me. What frightened me was the separation of intentions. Then I proposed a rule. A marriage without shared goals is not a marriage. It is a partnership with an exit plan already drawn.